She walked slowly down the street, her small grocery bag swinging gently at her side. The sun was warm, and the day seemed ordinary, almost too quiet. For many people passing by, it was just another afternoon. But for her, each step was a little heavier than the last. She was an elderly woman, living on her own, and trips to the store were her routine. The world around her moved fast, cars honking, people on their phones, footsteps rushing by, but for her, life had slowed down to a careful pace. She clutched the bag tightly, holding onto it like it was her anchor. A few apples, bread, and milk, simple items she always bought. She told herself she would be fine, but her body whispered otherwise. Her breaths grew shallow, her legs weak. She stopped for a moment, placing her hand on a nearby wall, pretending to check her bag so no one would notice how tired she looked. But inside, she knew something was wrong. She took a few more steps and then, without warning, her vision blurred. The world spun around her and her knees buckled. In an instant, she collapsed onto the sidewalk, her groceries spilling across the ground. Apples rolled away, the milk bottle tipped, and the bag crumpled. She lay there, motionless, her fragile frame barely moving as the city carried on. For a moment, no one seemed to notice. People walked by, glancing quickly before turning their heads. Some slowed down but didn't stop. Maybe they thought someone else would help, or maybe they were in too much of a hurry. Cars passed, music played from a nearby shop, and the world seemed strangely indifferent to the figure lying helplessly on the street. A young boy tugged on his mother's hand and pointed, but the mother, in a rush, pulled him away. A man on his phone glanced at her and then stepped aside, as though her collapse was an inconvenience. Seconds stretched longer, and the silence around her grew louder. She was breathing faintly, her lips dry, her body trembling. But she had no strength to call out. The air grew heavier. It was the kind of scene where the heart asks a question. Who will care enough to step forward? The woman's life hung in that question. The longer she stayed there, the greater the danger. Yet people hesitated. Some thought she was just resting. Others feared getting involved. The line between life and death had never felt so fragile. Her groceries painted a picture of her life. Simple food, nothing fancy, scattered across the concrete. A loaf of bread lay open, the apple still rolling near the curb, the milk dripping slowly from its cracked cap. It was as if the street itself was trying to tell a story, and yet the story was being ignored by those who passed. But then, a small moment of hope appeared. A pair of footsteps slowed down. Not hurried, not dismissive, different. A young couple, walking together, noticed her still body on the ground. The young woman gasped, and the man immediately leaned down. "She's not moving," the young woman whispered, her voice trembling. That moment marked a change in the air. People around, who had ignored her seconds earlier, now began to look. The couple bent down, placing their hands gently near the elderly woman's shoulders, checking if she was breathing. She stirred faintly, her eyes fluttering but not opening. Her chest rose weakly, and that was enough to confirm she was still alive. The young man shouted, asking if anyone had called for help. Silence followed. No one had. Phones were in people's hands, but not one had dialed. Annoyance flickered on his face before he pulled out his own phone and dialed emergency services. The young woman, meanwhile, lifted the elderly woman's head slightly, sliding her own scarf under it to keep her comfortable. The street began to shift. Those who had ignored her now watched with curiosity, some stepping closer but keeping their distance. The fear of involvement still held them back, but at least now they were witnesses to what was happening. The elderly woman's hand twitched, reaching weakly as though she wanted to hold something. The young woman noticed and held her hand tightly, whispering softly that help was coming. Though the woman's eyes didn't open fully, the faint grip she returned showed she had heard. Minutes felt like hours, but the couple's presence kept her from being alone in her most vulnerable moment. Without them, She might have been just another unnoticed figure in a busy street. But with them, she was a human being cared for, even if by strangers. The sound of sirens was still distant, but hope was finally in sight. What had begun as an ordinary day was already turning into a story of choices, choices that revealed who was willing to stop, and who was willing to look away. And in that very first chapter of her collapse, something powerful was clear. The kindness of strangers had begun to rewrite her fate. The sirens were still faint, but the tension in the air grew stronger with every passing second. The elderly woman lay weakly on the ground, her hands still resting in the stranger's grip. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, like a fragile thread about to snap. The young couple stayed close, refusing to leave her side. The man knelt by her shoulder, speaking firmly into his phone, giving the dispatcher details about her condition and exact location. The young woman tried to comfort her, brushing a strand of gray hair from her face and whispering that help was on the way. For a moment, the street around them seemed frozen. People who had walked past earlier now stopped at a distance. A few bent low as though debating whether to help, but most still hesitated, watching quietly. Some whispered among themselves, their eyes filled with concern but their feet unwilling to move closer. It was as if everyone wanted to help, yet only a few had the courage to step forward. Then another passerby, an older man carrying a briefcase, put his things down and joined the couple. He wasn't a doctor, but his calm voice carried authority. He checked her pulse at her wrist and nodded slowly. "She's weak, but still holding on," he said. "Keep her comfortable." His words steadied the young couple, giving them reassurance that they were not alone. The older man removed his jacket and gently placed it over her, shielding her frail body from the cool breeze that had begun to pick up. The elderly woman's lips trembled as though she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Instead, her eyelids fluttered and a faint sound escaped her throat. The young woman leaned closer, encouraging her softly. "Don't worry, you're not alone anymore. Just hold on a little longer." The group of strangers became a small circle of hope on an otherwise indifferent street. Cars slowed down as drivers rolled their windows to look. A few even parked nearby to see what was happening. Soon, there was a quiet crowd forming, watching from the edges. But it was the three people kneeling beside her who made the difference, the ones who chose action over silence. Time felt painfully slow. The man on the phone updated the dispatcher again, frustration slipping into his tone. "Where are they?" "She's not doing well," he said, before glancing back at the woman on the ground. He clenched his jaw, helpless but determined to keep her alive until help arrived. The older man who had joined them began guiding the others. "She needs her airway clear. Tilt her head slightly back good. Keep talking to her so she knows she isn't alone." His steady hands showed a lifetime of experience, perhaps not medical, but human enough to matter. The young woman obeyed, speaking gently, almost like a lullaby, telling the elderly woman that she was safe and cared for. The elderly woman's chest rose and fell in fragile movements. She was still fighting. Her fingers tightened slightly on the young woman's hand, and that small gesture gave them all renewed strength. It was proof that she was still there, still listening, still holding on. More strangers began to step forward. One woman rushed into the nearby store and returned with a bottle of water, offering it in case the elderly woman woke fully and needed it. Another person blocked traffic with his arms, waving cars away so the little group would have space and safety. What had begun with just two helpers was slowly turning into a united effort, each small action weaving together into something much larger. And yet, the atmosphere was still filled with tension. No one knew if she would survive. The fear of losing her hovered over the group, but so did the determination to keep her alive. It was as if the strangers had silently agreed they would not let her go without a fight. The faint sound of sirens grew louder, finally breaking through the stillness of the street. Relief spread across the young woman's face as she looked down at the elderly woman. "Do you hear that?" she whispered softly. "Help is almost here. You just have to hold on a little longer." The elderly woman's eyes opened just slightly, her gaze unfocused, but the hint of life still there. A weak sigh slipped from her lips, and though she couldn't speak, her hand squeezed tighter, as if to thank those who had stayed by her side. And so, as the ambulance drew closer, the group of strangers kept their silent vigil, proving that kindness doesn't need introductions, names, or recognition. Sometimes, it only takes a moment of courage to change the ending of someone's story. The sound of the sirens grew louder, echoing between the buildings, but to the strangers kneeling on the pavement, it felt as though the ambulance was still miles away. The elderly woman's breathing was shallow, sometimes pausing just long enough to make everyone hold their breath with her. The young couple stayed close, their hearts racing. The young man kept one hand gently on her shoulder, while the young woman still held her trembling hand tightly. The older man who had stepped in earlier stayed calm, though the lines on his forehead revealed the weight of worry. He spoke in a steady voice. "She's fighting, but she needs us to keep her stable. Don't let her head tilt forward. Keep her calm." He looked at the young woman and nodded as if to pass on some strength. She nodded back, whispering again to the elderly woman, promising her that help was on the way. The street around them was no longer just a blur of people walking by. It had turned into a small circle of life and death, a test of compassion. More strangers stepped up. A delivery driver parked his bike against a wall and hurried over, asking if there was anything he could do. The man on the phone handed him the cracked milk bottle and pointed at the groceries scattered across the ground. Without a word, the delivery driver collected the apples, bread, and the other small items, setting them carefully in a fresh bag he had. Even in crisis, respect for her belongings mattered. It was as if protecting her simple groceries was part of protecting her dignity. Another woman came forward, kneeling to shade the elderly woman's face from the sun with her umbrella. She didn't speak, but her actions spoke loudly. A teenager who had been standing at a distance finally overcame his hesitation. He pulled off his hoodie and offered it as another layer to keep her warm. These little gestures began to form a chain of kindness. Strangers united for someone they didn't even know. Still, fear gripped them all. The elderly woman's breathing grew weaker. Her lips moved faintly as though she was trying to speak, but no sound came. The young woman holding her hand bent lower, her ear close to her lips. She thought she heard the faintest whisper, but it was unclear, perhaps a word, perhaps just the sound of effort. Tears welled in her eyes as she reassured her. "Don't give up now. You're not alone. We're right here with you." The young man kept looking up and down the street, willing the ambulance to appear faster. Every second felt stretched, unbearable. "Where are they?" he muttered under his breath, frustration and fear blending together. He wasn't used to feeling powerless, but now all he could do was wait and hope that their efforts were enough. The older man leaned close again, checking her pulse. His face grew more serious. "It's slowing. She can't wait much longer." His words sent a shiver through the group. The young couple exchanged a glance, fearful, but determined not to let despair win. The strangers began to act with more urgency. The teenager who had offered his hoodie now ran to the corner of the street, waving frantically at the approaching ambulance, determined to guide them straight to her. The delivery driver stood in the road, holding up his arms to stop traffic completely, creating a clear path for the emergency vehicle. The young woman bent low, whispering words of comfort again and again, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "You're strong. You've made it this far. Stay with us. Please stay with us." Her other hand stroked the elderly woman's hair gently, a gesture so small but filled with all the care of someone who refused to let her feel alone. At last, the ambulance rounded the corner, its flashing lights cutting through the tense air. Relief rippled through the crowd, but the urgency remained. The strangers knew this wasn't the end yet. She still needed more than what they could give. As the ambulance came closer, the young woman felt a sudden squeeze on her hand, firmer than before. The elderly woman's eyes flickered open for a brief second, and though her gaze was weak and unfocused, it was enough. Enough to show she had heard them, enough to show she was still fighting, and in that fragile moment, surrounded by strangers who had chosen to care, her story turned from one of loneliness to one of unexpected family. They had done everything they could. Now it was up to the professionals. The ambulance pulled up, and paramedics jumped out with equipment in hand. But as they rushed toward her, the crowd of strangers who had formed around the elderly woman stepped back only slightly, unwilling to leave her until they knew she was safe. The race against time was nearly over, but the outcome still hung in the balance. The ambulance doors swung open, and 2 paramedics jumped out, carrying their equipment. The crowd of strangers parted just enough for them to kneel beside the elderly woman, but no one moved far away. The young woman still clutched the elderly lady's hand, and the paramedic gently told her, "We'll take over now." Her eyes filled with tears as she slowly let go, her fingers lingering for a moment as though afraid to lose that connection. The paramedics worked quickly, checking her pulse, her breathing, and attaching monitors. One of them looked up and said firmly, "She's critical, but stable enough to move." "Good thing you kept her airway clear. Whoever did that saved her life." The older man who had guided them earlier gave a small nod, relief washing over his face. The strangers exchanged looks, no words, but the meaning was clear. Their actions had mattered. The elderly woman was carefully lifted onto a stretcher. Her face was pale, but her chest rose and fell steadily now, assisted by the oxygen mask the paramedics placed over her mouth. The siren was turned back on, and the stretcher was rolled quickly into the ambulance. Just before the doors closed, the young woman leaned forward and whispered, "You're going to be okay. Don't stop fighting." For the briefest second, the elderly woman's eyes flickered open again, almost as if she had heard. The ambulance sped away, leaving the crowd standing in silence. For a moment, it felt as if the world had slowed down. The street was no longer just a busy place where people rushed past each other. It had turned into a stage where compassion had been proven real. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, but the small group of strangers who had stayed close lingered, their eyes following the sound of the siren until it faded. Hours later, the elderly woman's family arrived at the hospital. They had rushed from another city after receiving the emergency call. Tears filled their eyes when they saw her in the hospital bed, hooked up to machines but alive. The doctor's words struck them with both fear and gratitude. She was very close to not making it. If those people on the street hadn't acted quickly, she wouldn't be here now. The family broke down, hugging each other tightly. They didn't know the strangers who had saved her, but they knew they owed them everything. Later that evening, when the young couple and the older man visited the hospital to check on her, they were surprised to be greeted with open arms. The elderly woman's daughter hugged them tightly, her voice shaking as she said, "You saved my mother's life. We can never repay you." The young woman felt her throat tighten, and she could only whisper back, "We just couldn't walk away." The older man stood quietly in the corner, his eyes misty. He had seen many things in his life, but the moment he saw her breathing again, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope in humanity. The doctor stepped in, smiling. "She's resting now. It will take time, but she has a chance to recover fully." He looked at the strangers and added, "Most people hesitate. But you didn't. That made all the difference." In that sterile hospital room, something remarkable happened. Strangers who had once passed each other on the street, unknown and unnoticed, now stood together like family. The elderly woman, still fragile, lay peacefully with her loved ones around her, and those who had saved her were embraced as part of that circle of love. But the story was not finished. What would come next would move everyone even more deeply. The following days would reveal an ending no one had expected, an ending that would not just bring tears, but also leave behind a lesson about kindness that no one would ever forget. The days passed slowly, but each one brought a little more strength back to the elderly woman. The doctors kept her under close watch, giving her medicines and care, while her family stayed at her side, holding her hand through every moment. Her color returned bit by bit, her breathing steadied, and the life that had nearly slipped away began to shine again in her eyes. What once seemed uncertain now carried hope, but the elderly woman herself could not stop thinking about the moment she collapsed and the faces she had seen in flashes before darkness pulled her down. She remembered the gentle voice that whispered comfort, the warm hand that held hers, and the people who refused to leave her even though they didn't know her. These were not family, not neighbors, not friends from her past. They were strangers who had appeared at the exact moment she needed them most. When she was well enough to speak again, her first request was simple: "Please, bring me the people who helped me." Her family didn't know if they could find them, but they promised they would try. The young couple and the older man had left their names and numbers at the hospital before going home, just to check in on her progress. When they were called, none of them hesitated. They came together, their hearts full of concern for the woman they had saved. The day they visited, she was sitting upright in her hospital bed, a light blanket over her lap. When they entered, her eyes filled instantly with tears. Slowly she lifted her frail hands, reaching toward them as if they were long-lost family returning home. The young woman rushed forward and gently took her hand, while the young man and the older gentleman stood by, humbled and emotional. "You saved my life," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "You were there when I had no one. You gave me back the chance to see another sunrise." Tears rolled down her cheeks as her voice cracked with emotion. The young couple shook their heads softly. "We only did what anyone should have done," the young man said, though deep inside he knew not everyone had stepped forward that day. The older man, his voice low, replied, "You don't owe us thanks. We were simply in the right place at the right time." But the elderly woman pressed their hands tighter. "No," she said firmly, her voice steadier now. "I thought I was going to leave this world alone, unnoticed. But you showed me that I wasn't invisible. You showed me that kindness still lives in people's hearts. You became my family when I had none around me." Her words broke down the last bit of composure in the room. Even her daughter, standing nearby, wiped her tears. The young woman leaned down and hugged her gently, whispering back, "You're not alone anymore. We'll always remember you." In that room, something beautiful happened. Barriers of age, background, and circumstance faded away. What remained was a bond formed not by blood, but by compassion. The strangers who had once hurried through their own lives without knowing her now stood as her protectors, her friends, her chosen family. Before they left, the elderly woman made one last request. She wanted a photograph taken with all of them together. As they stood by her bedside, smiling through tears, the picture captured more than just faces. It captured a moment of humanity at its purest. Later, when she was discharged from the hospital, she invited them all to her modest home. She served them tea with trembling but eager hands, and they sat together, sharing laughter, stories, and quiet moments. For the first time in years, her house felt alive with warmth. The story that began with her collapsing alone on the street ended with her surrounded by love she never expected. Strangers had stepped forward in her darkest moment, and in doing so, they had given her more than life. They had given her a family she thought she had lost forever. And for those who were part of that day, they carried away a lesson that would remain with them always. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change not just one life, but many. It can bring tears, healing, and hope in ways that no one could ever forget.